globe. So let's talk about authoritarian states. Stalin's Russia from 1924. So let's start off with Stalin's rise to power. In 1922, Stalin became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. This gave him patronage, which meant that he was able to give roles to his friends and those who were loyal to him. This was especially strengthened by the Lenin enrollment from 1922 to 1925, where the party members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union increased from 340,000 to 600,000 members. Therefore, Stalin was able to give them all a bunch of jobs and instill loyalty to him. Lenin's funeral is where the rise to power begins. In 1924, Lenin passed away. Trotsky was initially offered the role of the orator, and Stalin instead took upon the role to establish himself as the clear heir to as Lenin's heir. However, Trotsky, there is some debate about whether or not he could have shown up. Trotsky claims that Stalin gave him the wrong date, while many historians debated that even with the wrong date and information, Trotsky could have still made it on time. So this shows the weakness of Trotsky. Even though he could have shown up, or whether he couldn't have shown up, it is still a fact that he rejected the role to be the orator and placed himself as the heir. Meanwhile, the left communists, Kamenev and Zinoviev, wanted a joint leadership. May 1924 was when Lenin's testament was suppressed. Lenin's testament detailed him bashing on Trotsky and Stalin, along with Kamenev and Zinoviev. Trotsky was ruled as dangerously ambitious, but the best successor to Lenin's throne. Stalin was declared to be, not to be the successor at Lenin's request. Kamenev and Zinoviev were described as the November criminals, the ones who did not join part in the October Revolution of 1917 that led to the communist rule. The suppression of Lenin's testament in May 1924 actually helped Stalin more. Although it said negative things about Trotsky, the things said about Stalin were more damaging to his reputation. Let's now go on to Stalin's consolidation and his outmaneuvering of Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, along with the right communists. The general perception at the time was that Trotsky was viewed as a dangerously ambitious who had control over the military, also an ambitious Jew who instilled admiration and distaste within the people, however not loyalty. While Stalin was down to earth, he had roots in the Bolshevik, as Trotsky was a Menshevik initially. He was underestimated, seen as simple and an idiot, and he formed loyalty through patronage. Key differences in Stalin and Trotsky's ideology include the new economic policy versus war communism. Lenin and Stalin, Stalin supported the new economic policy, in which Lenin introduced in 1921, which relaxed central control over the grain, restored the markets, and increased peasant rights, along with farming for profit. While Trotsky went against it with war communism, which abolished money, which stole grain and forbid farming for profit. Grain were given to the soldiers at the time of war communism. Meanwhile, Trotsky was seen as going against Lenin's plan. Another key difference in their ideology was the revolution in one country versus permanent revolution. Trotsky wanted an international uprising and wanted to export the revolution, and thus an international uprising would only secure the Union, while Stalin believed that the soil and industrial agriculture issues should be solved first in order to rival the world. Trotsky also tried to attack bureaucracy, in which he criticized the factionalism that was being built within the Soviet Union. However, Trotsky failed to realize that the state was already bureaucratic by then, and already a faction which was left and right, although it was banned. In 1925, Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev joined in a triumvirate to ally against Trotsky. Trotsky tried to fight back, but ultimately failed, as in 1925, Trotsky was dismissed as the Commissar for War. However, after this, Zinoviev and Kamenev wanted to form a united opposition amongst the left to abandon the NAP, seeing the economic problems that it caused. In 1926, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev formed a bloc to go against Stalin. However, by this time, Stalin has garnered too much support to be defeated. Thus, in November 1927, Trotsky was dismissed from the Politburo, while Kamenev and Zinoviev were dismissed and replaced by loyal followers of Stalin, Molotov and Kirov. And finally, in November 1929, Trotsky was exiled. Therefore, this led to the defeat of the left communists. And yet, he still had to defeat the right, which consisted of people like Rykov and Bukharin. However, the right was on the side of Stalin at the start. They were loyal to Stalin until 1928, where Stalin pushed for abandoning the new economic policy. However, the right had little power and merely had the support of the Petrograd trade unionists, which were not enough. Therefore, after Stalin defeated the right by dismissing Bukharin and Rykov, Stalin was officially declared the Vozhd in 1929, or known as the Red Tsar. This would then foster his cult of personality. Let's talk about Stalin's economic policy now. Collectivization meant shared farming on government-controlled land. There's the Kolkhotsky and the Sovkhotsky, in which lands were either controlled by the government and peasants would work on, or there were other collective farms. Basically, were the same thing, but were given different names. The surplus that the peasants would farm would be used for industrialization. However, farming methods were often inefficient with limited progress and surplus. A key factor contributing to this failure was that the lack of heavy machinery and an understanding of efficiency in agriculture. They tried to employ 50 or 200 people per commune or collective farm. Nevertheless, there was still no surplus as they had limited machinery. Stalin also wanted to attack class enemies within the process of collectivization. He defined the kulak class as rich peasants who accumulated wealth via the new economic policies, and instilled the campaign of dekulakization, which required the secret police, the OGPU, and led to peasant infighting and creating a scapegoat in order to unite the people and maintain his authoritarian power. Collectivization was a massive failure, as many resisted, with over 30,000 arson attacks in between 1932 and 33. While this also halted collectivization initially, and Stalin blamed the officials using another technique of scapegoating and not taking accountability. He blamed the officials, calling them dizzy with power, and promised to push back on collectivization reforms. However, the promises were withdrawn and collectivization resumed shortly after. By 1932, everyone was hungry, starving. The intake of food had decreased greatly before the collectivization had started. For example, in Kazakhstan, 90% of the livestock had been drained. Production ceased and led to many peasants migrating to big cities in which they could not feed all. This led to a national famine from 1932 to 33. 10 to 15 million Russians died here. And as Isaac Dorscher remarks, a historian, it was the first ever man-made famine. However, the state denied this as to not ruin Stalin's image and cult of personality. It never occurred as the state claimed. Therefore, there was no foreign aid to be used, unlike the Russian famine that occurred during the Civil War. In 1939, production finally returned to that of pre-World War I Russia in 1913. Although collectivization was a poor policy that treated the workers poorly, it was a catalyst for urbanization, which saw many migrants move into cities from the farms and stop grain hoarding. However, this also led to the loss of, as mentioned, 10 to 15 million people. His other economic policy was industrialization, which was to turn Russia's economy into an autarky war economy. In the first 5-year plan, from 1928 to 32, quotas were employed to manage industrial production. However, many of these were fabricated by Soviet statisticians, and Western analysts also disagree on the reality being achieved by these quotas. These stats were fabricated to avoid punishment, as seen in the Shakti trials, where they killed and executed saboteurs who were sabotaging industry, and this showed the futility of resistance. There was also a cultural revolution, a sort of brutalist, constructivist culture being built into it, in which the Homo Sovietis was created as the Soviet man, a new breed of species. Gigantomania was also emphasized, and massive civil engineering projects such as Magnitogorsk were built during the time of the 5-year plan. In the second 5-year plan, from 1933 to 37, there was the movement of Alexei Stakhanov, or the Stakhanovite movement, the legendary coal miner who mined 100 tons of coal in 5 hours. Of course, this was a myth propped up by officials, but like the Little Red Book and Pei Feng's diary, this is a use to increase national unity, spirit, enthusiasm. There was a massive decline in living standards for the factory workers. However, Michael Lynch, author of the Stalin's Russia book from 1924 to 1953, genuinely argues that some youths were caught up in the Stakhanovite movement and the propaganda efforts done by Stalin. The results of the second 5-year plan was okay. Coal production has increased by 5 times, steel by 6 times, oil 2 times, and electricity 4 times. However, there are many limitations to this. There's poor industry balance with a focus on heavy machinery and heavy industry rather than agriculture. Workers were neglected, and the decline of living standards continued to that of pre-war Russia. So that's about it for Stalin's chapter. Now let's take a look into the historiography. Was Stalin the master economic planner? Stalinists would argue yes, that is the Stalinist view, because they are pro-support of Stalin, so you could make that historiographical debate between was it a good thing or was it not. Norman Stone argues that it was short-sighted policies, while Alec Noe argues that it was poor economics and merely a political expediency. So these are all perspectives that can be used to evaluate the success of Stalin's economic policies. Furthermore, there's a debate regarding if these economic policies were being used as political expediencies to foster Stalin's cult of personality, the prestige of the Soviet Union. Peter Gatrell says yes, it was a success and sustained them during World War I with no connection to political expediency. Sheila Fitzpatrick criticizes Stalin's use of gigantomania and building Magnitogorsk, along with worker conditions. She emphasizes that Stalin was tough but offered a stable Soviet economy, while Dmitry Volganov, who experienced life in the USSR firsthand, said it was to remove opposition and that his economic test and the treatment of workers was a test of loyalty to see who went against him. So this can be used as evidence of how Stalin used force to consolidate his power. That's it for Stalin's Russia. Thank you.